the story kind of starts with cast bars that had denture teeth put on top of them. And that's really kind of, for the most part, there were some other things that came along before this, right? There's the advent of a material called Vitalium and Palladium that kind of gave us the ability to make denture bases for partial dentures. When you make a full denture, it can be made out of plastic because it doesn't need to hold on to anything but gum tissue. Mm-hmm. And so it doesn't have to be reinforced by anything. There's the force that you can put on is only as good as your gum tissue, right? So that generally doesn't need sort of a metal base. But when you're going to attach it to other teeth, it needs some sort of wiring and some sort of reinforcement to be able to grab onto other teeth. Right. And so that was probably the original drive to sort of add tooth-like plasticky materials to metal, right? And so when you fast forward that to when dental implants are starting to be used, there were a lot of different types of implants. And that would be an interesting one to talk through, different subperiosteal implants, different types of implants that kind of came into vogue and fell out before we really got good. The best way to describe them now, just for patient education or people that are listening, is we kind of refer to them as endosseous dental implants. So endosseous means within the bone dental implants. So it's not like just sitting on the outside. It's a screw that goes on the inside of the bone. Right. So in all of that melee, I think it was around the 80s, somewhere in the 80s and 90s, they started to take these dental implants and started to try and figure out how to attach them with some sort of metal reinforcement, because again, now we have something to grab onto with that plastic that sort of represents teeth and can function as teeth. Okay. And that lasted quite a while because, you know, if that was even, say, late 90s or mid 90s, we were still producing those and making them and delivering them when I first started on the full arch scene, which would have been like 2010 to 2013, somewhere in there. Really? Yeah. And for a long time, well, we'll talk about the process. So do you know anything about the process in terms of making a cast bar?
I don't. I've got so many questions.
Okay. So to start, when you would make a cast anything, you have to make sort of a duplicate version out of XYZ material. A lot of times we use a material called like Durlon, and there's different things that you can cast up, right? And so typical casting, you make this model or mold, wax, whatever the material is, and you put it in a furnace with it, and it spins down, and you melt the gold or whatever metal alloy you're going to melt down, and it spins it into the cast, right? Okay. It's in this huge spinning furnace, basically. Right. And so the very, very first bars, we didn't have milling machines. We didn't have the computer power and all of that. And so a lot of our posts that we would put inside of teeth to reinforce for, say, root canal procedure, that's where casting kind of really began. And then they started casting. They used to make an abutment that would go inside of a single implant that was castable, right? It had some sort of ability to be cast and make it so that it was a custom tooth that held on to the crown on top. Okay. And so what we used to go through is these really like longish procedures to get good impressions and such, so that then the lab could then build and wax and mold your custom bar to then hold on to your implants. Okay. And so that was something that took time, and it took art or like some sort of artistic ability or some sort of like hand skills on both the dentist and the lab side. And it was very time consuming because you can imagine when we take our information now, all of that information is just assumed as super accurate and is perfect. Right. So we can try in teeth right away. Even if the teeth aren't perfect, we can fix that file, but where the implants are is sort of assumed now, right? Back in the day, we had to go through a process to make sure that those implants were exactly in the right position. Right. So when we would go through that, and I'll talk more, because I came in really at the end of cast bars, And we did do a few, but more on the beginning of milled bars. That was actually like the hot, sexy topic. And I believe that the process to get the information is very similar. So if I'm wrong on a cast bar, I apologize, but we'll assume that milled and cast is very similar in terms of the visits.
Right.
So your first visit was an impression to sort of get where everything was. Then you had another visit to get a more accurate version of where the implants were, okay?
Okay.
And to do that, they would take your stone model of where these implants are, and they would put analogous pieces, analogs, in, and essentially glue them together in some way. You know, in our case, speaking almost to the end of when we were even doing those, it would be they would send us back what's called a verification jig. And a verification jig took those analogs and essentially they made essentially a plastic wire, if you would call it, band or thick sort of like worm of material that went through all the implants. And then they would cut them all in between the implants. Why? Well, stone, when it changes, when it hardens, kind of shrinks and deforms.
Sure.
So I can't take an impression of you, pour it up in stone, and have it be an exact perfect replica enough to put metal in your head.
Right, sure.
So we would your visit would have to be a verification jig. So you would try in each one of those parts, right? So because it's now segmented. And then we had to glue in every single one of those parts back together. And what that would do is sort of accommodate for the shift in the stone.
Okay.
So when you would bring that verification back, that jig back to the lab, or put it back on the stone model, sometimes it wouldn't fit because it had been distorted in the transfer of the impression to the stone.
Right.
And so what you would then have to do is, this is real life, and it takes forever to work through it. And you can imagine or talk through it. You can imagine in real person, this takes forever. So then what you would do is you would then cut the stone model all apart and wherever it wasn't seated correctly and refix it relative to the other ones. Now, I'm sure there were lots of lab guys that knew they could look at it and know exactly what needed to change. But you can imagine, even if you have 3 that are perfect and say the 4th one isn't, it's very hard to figure out which one is the offender.
Right.
You just know that it doesn't fit, right? I never gained that eye because I would look at them if it was off and go, oh man, I think it's easier if we just start over again.
Yeah, right.
But there were guys out there that really knew what they were doing in terms of how to seat them.
Sure.
So once you would seat that, once that part was done, sort of simultaneously or separate to that, you would then start to create a model in wax of where you wanted the teeth. Okay.
Okay.
So very similar to a denture. A denture, when you're fitting that for the teeth, you pick out the size, the color, the shape, you ask for it, and they'll send you a plastic base that's approximately what the patient looks like, and on it will have a block of wax. So you've seen those steps. So when that block of wax came in, you would shape it so that it would push their lip out properly and get the lip line properly, the vertical dimension, right, where how much tooth is showing, etc.
Yes.
And so you would dial all that in. Then you would mark the midline. Okay, so that's another visit. Now we're 4 or 5 visits in,
Right.
and the patient's already ready to, go crazy in your office.
Sure.
So after that, they would send you back that same. We go to the lab. They would put the teeth in, send that back to you. You would try that in the patient, and then you could actually. Well, the nice thing about doing it this old way was if there was something just slightly off, you could kind of push the tooth because it was in wax.
Right.
You could kind of alter things. Now, the problem was by that time, generally, they've incorporated the bar, okay? So now you have the model that you're putting in or what you're putting into the patient is the now made metal bar with where they think that the wax with the teeth needs to go,
Right.
okay? When that would happen, generally, your bar would end up in a place that was sort of so bizarre relative to the teeth that we ended up with a lot of speech problems and complaints about my temporary is so much better because there wasn't so much material here. That's kind of what we ran into quite a bit. That's where a lot of these sort of myths and problems come. And that's why I'm spending a lot of time on this part, this type of restoration, is because it's probably the most widely recognized and used, with the exception of zirconia now.
Right.
But up until now, this has been our historic work frame. Everything has kind of come out of that as a result of, let's just use this part and piece, or we don't like that so much, let's get away from it.
Right,
That's kind of the two directions that have spurred on development.
Sure.
So when you would get that wax up with a bar, the worst and funniest thing was, if it was in the patient too long, like let's say you had to go to the waiting room and get approval from their mom, aunt, uncle, spouse, whatever it was,
right.
Bring them back in. Sometimes it was in their mouth so long it would start to melt the wax.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sure.
And so the tooth that you had just put in perfectly is now sort of like dripping off to the side. Not dripping, but like kind of mushing off to the side. Or if they bit down too hard and it was a little mushy, it would kind of distort everything.
The pros and cons of wax.